Who are the Samaritans? So, the Samaritans are a people, or the descendants of a people. Today they number a few hundred, but in the past they were a few million. And in the past they were quite important. And they are non-Israelite people who adopted Israelite customs as well as pagan ones. And they dwell in the former area where the lost 10 tribes dwelt. They dwelt in Samaria. And historically they were quite important. They are mentioned in the Old Testament, in the Jewish, that is in the Jewish Bible. Also mentioned in the New Testament with the story of the Good Samaritan. Why was the story of the Good Samaritan so important? Because the Samaritans were considered a bad people, an antagonistic nation, so that when one of them did act in a neighbourly way, it was exceptional. But that is for people who are adherents of that particular religious outlook to discuss. At all events, I'm just reminding you that the person of the Samaritan, the expression Good Samaritan, where it comes from and why it is used. A Good Samaritan in effect means someone who is otherwise considered bad, or of whom bad is accepted, of whom bad is expected, but who acts like a good person. And that, in a sense, also sums up certain aspects of the Samaritan history. Now, we had 12 tribes of Israel. 12 tribes of Israel were in the land of Israel. They conquered a good portion of the whole of the Promised Land, extending from the Nile to the Euphrates, and far to the north. But they didn't expel or exterminate all of the inhabitants, and they ruled over most of it intermittently, but there were foreign elements always there, and eventually they intermixed with these foreign elements, and they learnt their ways, and they became like unto them. And they sinned against God Almighty, and they were eventually expelled from the land of Israel. First the 10 tribes were expelled, then Judah was expelled, but Judah returned. The 10 tribes did not. As I said, there were 12 tribes, but these 12 tribes are split into two separate kingdoms. There's the kingdom of Israel in the north, comprised of 10 tribes, and in the south there was the kingdom of Judah and Benjamin, later with most of the Levites, and they had their own independent kingdom of Judah, and from this kingdom of Judah derived the basic elements of the Jewish people. Whereas in the north, the majority of the tribes also were in the kingdom of Israel, and this kingdom of Israel was conquered by the Assyrians, and its inhabitants were taken into exile by the Assyrians, taken into different areas. And also a portion of them were given over directly by the Assyrians to Phoenicians and Philistine proxies, who took them overseas in ships and transported them to Spain and to other areas in the west, whereas the majority of them were taken into the interior of the Assyrian Empire, where they joined up or became identified as the Cimmerians, the Scythians and the Goths, and they also became prominent in the Assyrian Empire. At one stage they managed to almost take virtual control of the Assyrian Empire. Meanwhile, the Medes and the Babylonians had rebelled, and they attacked Assyria. The Israelites in the Scythian forces joined these Medes and Babylonians and helped them in overcoming Assyria. But after defeating Assyria in a series of battles in which it may well be that it was the Israelites who took the primary role in destroying the Assyrian forces, after which they had a celebration, a feast, in which the leaders of the Scythians became drunk, or gotten drunk, were given drink, and then exterminated. After that, the Medes and the Babylonians divided the Assyrian Empire between them, And instead just began to drive the Scythians and Israelites out, and these moved out to the north of the Caucasus Mountains, and also to the west. And then also those who were driven to the north went westward, and they all eventually converged in Western Europe, and they became Western European nations, from which derive Western countries such as the USA, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, as well as the nations along the periphery of Europe, the western periphery of Europe. And these nations are descendants of the physical descendants of the 10 tribes of Israel, but they had forgotten who they were. They became like the Goyim, like the Gentiles, like the pagans, and eventually they shall return and be reconciliated both with the God of Israel and with the Jewish people. But at the moment they're not that. They are out there, separated, and they have their own role to play in history, and this was the will of the Almighty God of Israel. Meanwhile, Judah, the kingdom of Judah, had resisted through miracles, through the divine intervention. For instance, when an angel came down and saved Jerusalem in the time of King Kiskiau from the Assyrians, angel came down and slew 185,000 Assyrian troops at night in their sleep. And so Judah had remained independent from the Assyrians. And the king Yoshiao, it asserted itself, it reasserted itself, and even fought against fought on the side of the Scythians, and it fought against the Assyrian forces, or assisted the allies of those, the allied alignment that was fighting against Assyria. At all events, after the Assyrian Empire was divided between the Medes and the Babylonians attacked Judah. And conquered Jerusalem, destroyed the first temple, and they exiled the Jews to Babylon, that is, to areas of Mesopotamia. Meanwhile, the Medes have been replaced by the Persians. Eventually, the Persians conquered the Babylonians, and they allowed the Jews to return. And a portion of the Jews did return. At first there was only a minority who came back, but then they grew and multiplied, and then they developed, and when they came back and returned, and they wanted to rebuild the temple, and the Samaritans, people known as the Samaritans, came and offered to help them rebuild it, but the Jews of Judah who had returned refused their assistance. So we may ask, who were the Samaritans? So when the 10 tribes, that is, all of the inhabitants of the north, were taken into exile, we are told that the king of Assyria, in 2 Kings 17, verse 24, the king of Assyria brought people from Babylon, Cutha, and Ava, Hamath, and from Sepharvaim, and placed them in the cities of Samaria instead of the children of Israel, and took possession of Samaria and dwelt in its cities. So the king of Assyria took people from Babylon, that is in Mesopotamia. Cutha is also origin in Mesopotamia, nearby Babylon. Hamath apparently was the region in northern Syria. Incidentally, Cutha, the name Cutha, where some of these people came from, is important because in Jewish writings, the Samaritans are referred to as Kuti or Kuthim. So this should be remembered, the Kuthi. Not only is another name for the Samaritans, because as the Bible tells us in 2 Kings 17:24, that some of them came from the city of Kuthim, others came from Babylon, others came from Ava, Hamath, and from Sepharvaim. They're placed in the cities of Samaria, and they settled there. And also we find this is what that was what the Bible says, and we find this confirmed. We find this confirmed in Assyrian records. We have an Assyrian inscription which says, inhabitants of Samaria who agreed and plotted with the king hostile to me not to do service, not to bring tribute to Ashur, and did battle I fought against with the power of the great gods. My lord, I counted as spoil 27,280 people, together with the chariots and gods and so on. I settled the rest of them in the midst of Assyria. Here he confirms he took away the remnant of the lost 10 tribes of Israel and settled them in Assyria. I repopulated Samaria more than before. I brought from it people from countries conquered by my hands. I appointed my eunuch as governor over them, and I counted them as Assyrians. So that is one of the several inscriptions we have concerning the repopulation of the former area of Israel with foreigners. And these foreigners came in and they settled there, and when they settled there they had trouble. There was an outbreak of attacks of roaming herds of lions who were attacking the inhabitants. And this was a phenomenon. This is a known phenomenon from Sumer, also from Mesopotamia. We have records of similar phenomena occurring in that time. Apparently, due to climate changes and so on, the area was much more fertile than it is now. It was wetter and greener. All of that area, there were jungle there, type and savanna regions, where now there is desert. There were also lions in the country. But when there was a shortage of food or a shortage of water, then these lions would sometimes enter settled areas and attack the population. So this is also what happened in this case. So lions, herds of lions, began to attack these Samaritan settlements of non-Israelites in the former region of Israel. And this word of this problem came to the authorities of Assyria, to the king of Assyria, and it was also told that this was happening to them because they know not the manner of the God of the land. This is in 2 Kings 17:24. But also we are told, it was told at the beginning of their dwelling there, they did not fear the Lord, therefore the Lord sent lions among them, which killed some of them. So they spoke to the king of Assyria, saying, the nations whom you have removed and placed in the cities of Samaria do not know the rituals of the God of the land. Therefore you sent lions among them and did killing them, because they do not know the rituals of the God of the land. When the king of Assyria commanded, saying, send there one of the priests whom you brought from there, let him go and dwell there, let him teach them the rituals of the God of the land. And one of the priests whom they had carried away from Samaria came and dwelt in Bethel. Bethel taught them how they should fear the Lord. So they feared the Lord, and from every class they appointed for themselves priests of the high places. And they sacrificed with them the shrines of the high places. They feared the Lord, that is, they feared God of Israel. They feared him, that they served their own gods, according to the rituals of the nations from among whom they were carried away. These nations feared the Lord, yet served their carved images. Also their children's children have continued doing so as their fathers did, even to this day. So we're told in 2 Kings 17:41. So that is how the Samaritans began. The Samaritans were non-Israelites, were settled in the place of the Israelites. They were foreigners, but they were settled in the region, and they were, by command of the king of Assyria, they taught aspects of the Hebrew faith, of the Hebrew religion, but they did not keep all of it. They kept only part of it, and they also continued to adhere to their previous pagan practices. And they dwelt there. And some of them also intermarried with the remnants of the Israelites who had remained, who somehow ever got to that region. The Bible tells us that all of the Israelites have been exiled. Also, the Assyrians said they'd taken all the Israelites away. Also, archaeological evidence shows us that there was not one single settlement dating from the Israelite period that remained intact, that had not been utterly destroyed, and there's only a layer of ashes whenever we get to the period of the Assyrian conquest. That is a layer of ashes of complete destruction. Nevertheless, according to oral tradition and other indications, there was a small minority, a very small number of Israelites who remained in the area, and these intermarried with the Samaritans who were there. Though most of them gravitated to Judah. There's some who remained, some of these intermixed with the Samaritans. So this has to be taken into account. There's also, and also in Jewish tradition, we find remnants we find references to this. And then when we told in Ezra 4, when the Jews were allowed to return from exile of Babylon, they began to rebuild the temple, to rebuild Jerusalem. Samaritans came and offered their assistance in this rebuilding, and the Jews of Judah under Ezra refused. They refused to allow the Samaritans to participate with them. So thereafter the Samaritans did all they could to impede the building of Jerusalem, and to do what they could to harm the Jews by physical attacks, and also by sending bad reports or malicious, slanderous reports about them to the Assyrian authorities, to the Persian authorities, to try and get the Persians to forbid the further rebuilding of Jerusalem. And this worked. It worked on and off. It worked on and off. The Jews would start to rebuild the temple and the walls of Jerusalem. Then the command would come from a Persian monarch to desist, to stop doing so. Then they would be managed to begin to do it again. And this went on and off for a while until eventually they were successful in rebuilding it. And at all events, the Jews eventually did rebuild the temple. And meanwhile, the Babylonians were conquered by had been replaced by the Persians, and the Persians in turn were conquered by Alexander the Great, the Macedonian Greek. And when Alexander the Great died, the area was divided into four, amongst these four generals. The region of Israel was split between those descendants of Alexander's generals who ruled in Egypt, known as the Ptolemies, and those who ruled in Syria, known as the Seleucids. Under the Seleucids in Syria, actually Greeks, referred to in Jewish literature as Greeks, but perhaps they were Greeks to some degree. They had a Greek culture at all events, and they attacked the Jews and attempted to force the Jews to worship pagan gods, and the Jews rebelled against them and fought a long series of wars against them and eventually weakened them greatly, or they themselves came to terms with the Jews and allowed the Jews to rule autonomy over the region. And meanwhile there was the Jews under the Hasmonean or Maccabee dynasty managed to gain control of much of the former land of Israel. They also gained control over the Samaritans, and they began to force the Samaritans to come more into line, more into tandem, as if to say, with Jewish practices. And this Jewish process amongst the Samaritans continued for some time, for quite a while, and the Samaritans at one stage were considered to be almost Jewish. There was a point when they were considered, in effect, would have been considered Jewish at one stage. A few of them may also have intermarried with the Sadducees. The Sadducees with the Cohens, with the priestly families in Jerusalem. And but it was discovered by the sages that the Samaritans, or a portion of them at least, were secretly still worshipping a foreign god. They were worshipping a god in the form of a dove. She was buried in Shechem, and they had secret. They had idolatrous intentions. So the Jews froze the process. The Jews henceforth did not recognize the Samaritans as legitimate. They did not have any more contact with them, though they continued to exist side by side. At times the relationships were good. At times they were not. The Jews were always suspicious of the Samaritans, and the Samaritans also were antagonistic to the Jews. We heard from Josephus. Josephus says that when the Jews were powerful, the Samaritans used to emphasize their Hebraic connections, claimed to be descendant from the tribes of Israel, and they would be friendly towards the Jews. But when the Jews were weakened, when foreigners ruled over the Jews, or when there was powerful pagan entities in the area, they would then emphasize their non-Israelite ancestry and toady up, as if to say, to the foreigners. And they would claim at that stage, at that time, to be of Phoenician or Canaanite origin. And they also numbered had quite large numbers, maybe millions of them eventually. And there were also Samaritans in different areas in the Middle East. There were Samaritans in Syria, Samaritans in Mesopotamia, also Samaritans in Africa. The Samaritans may have influenced the Karaites. Offshoots of the Samaritans may also have influenced quite a few African tribes, who henceforth believed that they were descended from Israel. The Samaritan influence may also have reached Ethiopia. There are different theories on this subject, and it is interesting, but it's not a field that we have gone into. But if someone is interested, they should know that studies along in this direction have been done. It might be worth following up upon. This was the case. At all events, after the Seleucids Greeks came the Romans, and the Romans were followed by the Byzantines, who were in effect simply Romans in the east. The Byzantines became Christians and severely persecuted the Samaritans. Very many of the Samaritans became Christian, or they were wiped out. And after that came the Arabs, and under the Arabs a good portion of the Samaritans became Muslim. They say that the present-day Arab population of Shechem, a major city in Samaria, on the West Bank, is a good portion of the people living there are descended from Samaritans. I was there as a soldier for about a month or a bit more, and they have their features, and the physical appearance is similar to that there's a Samaritan community there. A lot of the Muslims also look similar to them, as if they could be related, so there's something in this. The Samaritans, in effect, they were scattered all over the world, and some claims to be descended from lost tribes of Israel may have had Samaritan origins. One point distinguishing the Samaritans was their acceptance of the written Torah, or their own version of the written Torah. They rewrote the Bible. They rewrote, in effect, only the Pentateuch, the Torah scroll, the 5 books of Moses, plus the book of Joshua. They're the only 2 Bible books that they use, or maybe they have other writings, but they're the 2 books of the Bible that they do use. And in these books, they introduced a few changes of their own. For instance, putting the Mount Gerizim instead of Mount Zion and things like that, and replacing, emphasizing the sanctity of their area, of Samaria, of the Shomron, of Shechem, of the city of Shechem, and so on. And also, in their practices, they were known for accepting anything that was written in the Bible, written down in black and white in the Bible, but rejecting oral traditional explanations of the sages. They, in effect, attempted to follow the Bible as it is literally written, as it is literally there. They were the first so-called Karaites. Later on, there was a group of Jews who broke away and also said the same, also rejected the oral traditions and set up their own religion. And quite a few of the areas where they became prominent were those areas in which the Samaritans had been numerous at one stage previous to that, so they may have been physical descendants of them. Damascus, incidentally, the area of Damascus was also once predominantly Samaritan, and it could be that the Arab inhabitants of Damascus are also in part descended from Samaritan ancestors. Whether or not the Karaites were physically descended from the Samaritans or not, ideologically they are one and the same. They have the same basic ideological outlook. The Samaritans rejected the oral tradition, even though the Bible strengthens it, and cannot understand the Bible without it, cannot even follow the commandments of the Bible without it. But even so, they did as best as well as they could, and they rejected anything that was not written in black and white. And the Karaites also did the same. So here we have a direct connection. And historically, the Karaites were also anti-Jewish, against the Jewish people, and so too were the Samaritans. A point of interest is that in the 1850s, the Arabs the area was ruled by the Turks, by the Ottoman Turkish Empire, ruled over the area. Turks ruled over the area, but the population was Arab. They ruled over the Arabs in the area and the Jews who were in this region. In the 1850s, the Arabs, who were always trying to destroy the Samaritan community, to hurt them like they hurt any minority who ever existed amongst them. So the Arabs had designs to exterminate all of the Samaritans in their region. And they plotted this, and they were about to carry it out when the Samaritans asked the Jews of Jerusalem to intervene on their behalf, and the Jews then asked the English, rather the British who were in the area, were not. The British at that time had diplomatic relations with the Turks. They were helping the Turks, and the Turks needed to stay on good terms with the British, so the British intervened after the Jews had asked them to do so, and they in effect prevented a massacre of the Samaritans, which would have taken place if it was not for that. And so then we had the Jews returning to the land of Israel and setting up the State of Israel, and some Samaritans after 1948, in the Israelite Declaration of Independence, some Samaritans were in the Jewish area, the Jewish region of Hulon. Others remained in Shechem, which was under Jordanian rule for a while, until in 1967 the Jews also conquered that. One thing about the Samaritans had diminished. Now there are only a few hundred amongst them. Not so long ago there were even less. For decade after decade, for years after years, they had always been intermarrying cousin would marry cousin, first cousins, and so on. And they had a lot of sicknesses and genetic diseases and problems amongst them. In the 1920s, they decided to change their policy. Up until then, they had refused permission to any member of their community to marry anyone from outside. From the 1920s, they began to allow their males to marry Jewish women, because they had no choice in order to save themselves from the genetic degeneration and obliteration. So they allowed themselves to marry Jewish women, and they did so. And now technically, nearly all Samaritans technically are descended from Jewish mothers or grandmothers or great-grandmothers, and according to Jewish law would be considered technically Jewish. Since membership of the Jewish religion goes after the mother. There's a problem after a certain if a Jew changes his religion and does not return to it after 1 or 2 generations and is considered non-Jewish. That is a technicality. Physically, they are descended along in their mother's line, mainly from Jewish people, or to a significant degree from Jewish women. So that is also worth taking into consideration. Another point is that in the 1671, a British scholar named Robert Huntington visited the region, and he found that he came in contact with the Samaritans. The Samaritans had scrolls, Torah scrolls, and history books and so on that they had written in their script. And these writings were of great value to researchers and also to antiquarians and enthusiasts, and as well as being of great value from an academic point of view, they're also very valuable. They're worth fortunes. So a British adventurer came to the region, and he persuaded some of the Samaritans that they had their brethren in Europe, amongst the British and amongst the French and so on. And through this persuasion, he managed to get hold of manuscripts and use them for his own purposes. Shortly afterwards, we find reports from the Samaritans saying that they had traditions that they were related to people in Britain and in France. And so this might have been due to the persuasive influences of this Richard Huntington, this adventurer, or may have been a genuine tradition. We don't know. But the fact is that there were some Israelites amongst the Samaritans. Samaritans had been living in lands that formerly belonged to the Lost End tribes, and the Lost End tribes had in fact, indeed, in truth, been transferred or migrated to the west, and they had settled in the British Isles, and it's where they are to be found at present. So perhaps we had come full circle. Perhaps the Lost End tribes are soon to return. Perhaps they will return to Samaria. Also Zechariah indicates Zechariah and Micah, the prophets Zechariah and Micah indicate the Lost End tribes will return to the regions of Lebanon and Gilead and Bashan, which are in Syria and present-day Lebanon, and the regions to the north, and also in Jeremiah, another texts, it is indicated that also returned to the region of Samaria on the so-called West Bank. So perhaps the lost tribes will return, and perhaps we have come full circle. And this whole story of the Samaritans is worth noting. Also, incidentally, we should mention the Druze. The Druze are not Samaritans; they have their own religion. Traditionally they considered Jethro, the father-in-law of Moses, to have been their father, their forefather, their ancestor. On the whole, they have been pro-Jewish, with exceptions. With Jews also serve in the Israeli army. They serve well. Many of them are genuinely patriotically devoted to the Jewish state. Some are not, but many are. And they also have a tradition that they are descended from the tribes of Israel, as well as being related to Jethro, the father-in-law of Moses, and as well as that, they had a tradition that they were related to the British and to the French. And we don't know where these ideas originated from. They might have been inventions, might be because the British and the French were in the area, that they wanted to cultivate good terms with them, or they admired them and wished to consider themselves related to them. And perhaps having always been a minority, it was their custom to always toady up to become friendly with the dominant powers in the region. So this might be why they invented such tales. But apart from that, there may always also be some truth in them. And maybe some truth in them. The lost 10 tribes really are to be found amongst Western peoples. The British really are descendants of Joseph. In part, that is where the descendants of Joseph are to be found. That is where descendants of Joseph gave expression to their tribal identity, to their Israelite ancestry. Amongst Western peoples, amongst these peoples, amongst the British and the related nations. That is where the lost 10 tribes are to be found. And there are indications that some of the lost 10 tribes were also amongst the Druze and amongst the Samaritans, who knows. And even if they weren't, the fact is that the lost 10 tribes will return. They will return to this region, and they will once again dwell in there. They will dwell, as we know from Zechariah 10:10 and from the book of Micah, that they will dwell in the region of Gilead and Lebanon, which is modern-day Syria and Jordan, in other words, and Bashan, which is all of that region, and also in Samaria, which is on the West Bank, and they will return and reunite with Judah and dwell in the land of Israel, and the whole of the promised land from the Nile to the Euphrates will be divided up amongst the whole of the 12 tribes of Israel when they return, when there's a reunification and reconciliation between Judah and Joseph. And this is all for the future, but it could be that at present we are getting there. Perhaps there's an arousal amongst many people in this direction on these matters, and perhaps this is because subconsciously we are being told, informed to prepare ourselves, or we are being made aware that the time for these events to take place might be getting closer than we think it is. At all events, may the Lord God of Israel help us. May He help all of the people of Israel. May He guide us and teach us the truth and help us to do what must be done. Thank you.